Okay, it is 5:45 in the morning, and we're going to try and do this. This is the early version. I've been recording at night for the most part, but we'll give this a go. I think at some point I'm probably going to make some mistakes, just in, getting my tongue tied, trying to say difficult words or something, but I've decided just to ignore that. So bear with me as I try to pronounce everything clearly and perfectly. If I make a mistake, I'll just repeat myself. This is like you doing your presentations for me in conversation class. If you make a mistake, you just keep going because the clock is ticking. I'm not going to spend time editing and trying to make everything perfect, but hopefully, like I said, things will get smoother as we go. I've been toying with the idea of doing a live lecture as well, which would mean that, of course, mistakes would just be broadcast instantly. So this is good practice for live situations too. Today, the government is supposed to announce whether we're going to extend again the online version of university this semester. I have a pretty good sense that from the responses I get from students and parents and professors' comments across Korea that the situation is getting worse in other countries, and we don't want to relapse to what we were dealing with a month ago. So my suspicion is that, excuse me, my suspicion is that the April 6th deadline will be extended again. We'll see. We'll find out by the end of today. We don't know yet, but that's my expectation. So I will get into the stuff. We stopped a little bit short of where I intended last class, so I'm going to do a little bit of catch up first because there are some important things to talk about. I was going to talk about Henry II and Samuel Beckett because that it's a really important event. Samuel Beckett was an archbishop. So I need to talk about, again, religion was one of the main centers of cultural belief. It was the main center. All medieval life sort of revolved around the church. The church was replaced by all kinds of different institutions, including universities, and hospitals and other things. There's all kinds of government departments, ministries that have replaced what the church used to do. So you have to think about sort of not having all these, healthcare, social services, universities, education, town halls and meetings, and what's it called, the Yusanguchang, the local, district hall, city hall, or any of those buildings didn't really exist. Everybody was living in towns, and the church was multifunctional. So the Archbishop of Canterbury was a very important person. You can think of him as being somewhat like a minister of everything. He's below the king, but he has a huge amount of influence on the population, and he basically, he's the boss of all of the churches in England. He's supposed to be responsive and beneath the Pope in Rome, but basically he's the English Pope. He's got a lot of leeway. He gets chosen and supported by the Pope, but he has power over what happens in England. So Samuel Beckett actually was sort of a low-born person who made his way up in the king's service, and then he was chosen by the king, and then you know how the story went. I described to you. So the king's men got rid of him, and his death became a rallying point for all kinds of resistance towards the king, and sort of affected all of society so deeply in a spiritual sense and a social and political sense that he's considered by some people to be the first English celebrity. So that's why we mentioned him. Now, Magna Carta is an equally important symbol of British culture, except at the time it wasn't as important. Samuel Beckett's death had sort of, as I told you before, we talked about social and historical and cultural context. What Samuel Beckett's death was an intense social moment where the king literally got dragged in front of a bunch of priests and whipped in public. And as I said before, you can't imagine that ever happening these days, that you would see a person who was guilty of murder or lying or cheating exposed like that, and punished in public. But that's what happened to Henry. So this process that starts in Magna Carta and with Samuel Beckett it's an evolution. Like I said, there's no revolution here, so they don't kill the king. There is a revolution later. We'll talk about the Civil War, the English Civil War, when they do kill the king in the 17th century. But for now, it's just checking the king's power. And Samuel Beckett checked the king's power, and he didn't like it. He dealt with it, and it backfired. The Magna Carta was like that, and later today we're also going to talk about the Peasant Revolt. And both of these events don't end up being revolutions, but you can see how they have elements of revolutionary ideas. It just doesn't have this fast, violent, big change that revolutions need to be called revolutions. We are going to talk about the Industrial Revolution later, which is called a revolution, but it's much slower than a classic revolution. Usually, true revolutionaries like Mao Zedong or Napoleon or Julius Caesar, or Alexander the Great, there's any number of people you can choose. I'm just saying the ones that pop in my head. But those people drove change, and it was violent, and it was powerful, and it was sudden. So in their lifetimes, everything completely changed. The Industrial Revolution takes over 100 years for the process to happen. So it's a multi-generational revolution, or it's actually a series of revolutions. But that's for a later class. So right now, the evolution of English culture, which starts to become British culture later, it's still just English that we're talking about right now. The Magna Carta was a document that King John was forced to sign. I was going to talk about Richard the Lionheart and the Crusades, but we can't talk about everything. So really super briefly, this will not be on the test though. There is this Crusader movement that starts at the end of the 11th century, and this is overlapping with everything I've told you so far from the Norman Conquest until Magna Carta. But they start sending armies, the Western Europe and Eastern Europe, start sending armies all over the place to spread Christianity and to fight against what they call non-believers, right? Heathens, pagans, or Muslims. In the Middle East, it's the Muslims that control, and they're the ones that are blocking Christian access to Jerusalem. So that's the main goal. But they do, in Spain, they have something called the Reconquista, where they fight against the Muslim state that's there, and they eventually defeat them and push them out of Spain and unify Spain. And we'll be talking about that in the next couple lectures, because Spain becomes a very powerful country, the most powerful country in the world, very suddenly, and this is a direct threat to England. So they do come into conflict in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. The Spanish become friends, enemies, but most of the time they're in competition with the English, so there's a power struggle there. The Magna Carta is tied up into all these events because England has lands in France, because as I explained to you, northern France is called Normandy. It's not part of France, really. There's no such thing as, a nation of France, and really the nation of France doesn't get consolidated until Napoleon's time completely. It's always separate, very distinct, loyal, organized, proud groups of people. There's different names for them, which I won't expect you to remember, but Aquitaine and Brittany which is where a lot of the Britons left to, emigrated when the waves of invasions happened. When the Romans left, over hundreds of years, a lot of Britons moved to northwestern France, excuse me, and they settled there, and that's why it's called Brittany still. Those people are descended, a lot of them, from Britons. So Brittany, Normandy, Aquitaine, Burgundy, these are all actual separate kingdoms. A lot of them are beneath the power of the king, which in fact the King of England is technically under the power. He's a vassal of the French king because William was a vassal of the French king, right? He was the Duke of Normandy, and so his superior was the French king. So when he went to England, he took over England, he became the King of England, he was still the vassal of the King of France. This created a huge amount of tension because you got two kings that are basically equal in power, mostly. You can argue one way or another, but they're counterparts to each other, but one of them technically has the ability to tell the other one what to do. And that's the contract, that's the deal, and you can't get out of that very easily. So Richard goes off to the Middle East. He goes off to try and take Jerusalem and fight Saladin the Great, and has some success, but also fails ultimately. He gets caught and ransomed. It's a really romantic story. He's a great hero to a lot of people. He's a great warrior. He's handsome. He's tall. He writes songs and he supports the arts, and he's just this gallant knight, like perfect knight warrior guy. And then he's fighting in France and he gets killed. So his younger brother John takes over, and John is that sneaky Prince John guy from the story of Robin Hood. He's been recast as Prince John, but he was King John. Whatever version you see of the Robin Hood story, it might be the Disney version, or I don't know, the live action version, or the Robin Hood Men in Tights, Mel Brooks comedy version, or the, Kevin Costner, the sort of classic type one, Robin Hood Prince of Thieves. There's, I don't know how many Robin Hood stories. The versions are all stories. Robin Hood was not a real person. We talked about King Arthur last time. Robin Hood is completely made up. There's no real Robin Hood person, and he's not really even based on a real person, but a lot of stories come together to make Robin Hood. And one of them is about the fact that King John was very unpopular. He oppressed the people, he overtaxed them, he lost his possessions in France, he kept taking money from people and sending armies to France and losing. So, basically the wealthy people in the chain of being, the guys that are underneath him, they're called barons, and there's different levels. There's lords, barons, jarls, that's a Danish Viking word, which we in English called earls. Those earls are very powerful. That's what King Harold's father was an earl. These guys, sometimes they own, massive sections, almost like the size of a province, like where we live in Daejeon, it's called Chungcheong province. An earl would have a territory like that, like a whole province would be his domain, and he would control those people, and then he would be responsible, the king would be able to summon him for various things. So you got your dukes and earls, and counts, and barons, and lords. So lords are the smallest, the lowest level generally. And now this is not perfect in any sense, and in different countries they have different names. But basically there's a hierarchy of rich people, just like there's a hierarchy of everything. You got plants at the bottom, and you got God at the top, and you have regular people all in the bottom, and then you have lords all the way up to the king. So these wealthy people, the king kind of needs their support, right? It's almost like it's not a republic in any sense. The king has all the power, but if the barons together decide they don't like the king anymore, and they don't want to pay him money, and they don't want to provide people, soldiers for the king's army, the king can't do anything. So that's essentially what happens is the barons get together and they basically tell the king, we're not doing what you say anymore. We don't like what you're doing. So we're going to get you to sit down here in Runnymede, in 1215, and we're going to make this document where it limits the things that you're allowed to do. You're not allowed to run around and kill anybody you want without giving them a chance to defend themselves. You can't arrest people, throw them in prison whenever you want. If you don't like somebody, you can't just grab them, kill them, or throw them in jail. That's not allowed anymore. But, you know, William the Conqueror did that. So they're trying to limit the power of the king. They try to make it so all of the barons have some sort of, you know, voice and can represent themselves. There's a whole list of different items that they tick some of the boxes in terms of giving more power to the elites. Now, Magna Carta gets looked at as the document that founds Parliament, which is not what it is. It is not representative in any sense. We're talking about fractions of 1%. Like, we're talking about less than 1,000 people in a country that might have 2 million people in it. Only less than 1,000 people get to give their opinion. And they don't even get to give their opinion very often. Just when the king needs money, he essentially has to summon these barons and get their support, right? So they're just trying to protect the rights of the rich people. But later, this Magna Carta document gets used to say the rights that John gave up. He thought of it as giving up his rights. He thought that the king should be able to do whatever he wanted, so he hated this thing. But essentially, he was admitting that these barons had rights. You know, when we talk about natural rights and human rights and privacy and you know, the police, reading your Miranda rights and everything. So like, you have the right to remain silent. You have a right to an attorney. When the police pull you over, they can't just do whatever they want. Some of these ideas have their origin in this written document, and that's why it's so important. Is because people took this small concession that the king and the government made and eventually extended it to every citizen. But at the time, it was not revolutionary at all, because you're really only talking about, you know, rich people making sure all their property and their influence over how the kingdom is run is maintained. But nonetheless, now Magna Carta has become this amazing, you know, event that kickstarted an 800-year process that is still ongoing, still evolving, but has resulted in citizens having more rights, democracy, parliament, constitutions, and everything else. So that's why, if you ever hear it, that's what Magna Carta means. Magna Carta is just Latin for the Great Charter, which is a charter is just a document that is recognized as being official. So 1215, this is the second date you have to remember. 1066 is William the Conqueror. 1215, Magna Carta. Don't forget. Okay. Now let's just move forward to about 100 years, to the end of the 13th century. I don't do justice to the Scottish or the Irish in this class, because I just can't. If this was just British culture, I would be talking about Ireland and Scotland a lot more. But the second half of this class is supposed to be America. And they get all mixed together sometimes, especially because America has, you know, a shorter history than the British culture does. But you can't talk about British culture without talking about the Scots. I've never been to Scotland, first of all. I've been to America many, many times. I've been to England once. So my Scottish friends are probably going to think that I need to actually visit and get a sense of what it's like. That's on my list. As soon as coronavirus is gone, I'm going to Scotland, I promise. I want to see Edinburgh and I want to see Glasgow. Some of my ancestors are from Scotland, so it's a very rugged country. I don't know what to compare it to for you. Most of you probably haven't been to North Korea, but you might look at it sort of like the relationship between, you know, geographically, that North Korea is very rugged and rocky and colder, whereas South Korea, especially as you go south towards Jeolla and towards Gyeongsang, where Busan is, you can just see as you go on the train, you can see the hills getting softer, the air warming up, and the green, more trees, less rock, less exposed rock, and different types of trees. Much better for growing food. England is like that too. It gets the warm air and the moisture from the Gulf of Mexico. It comes all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, and that's what moderates England's climate. So in England, you get much milder temperatures. It never gets too hot or too cold. I shouldn't say never. It rarely gets very hot or very good. They don't have extreme temperatures in England. Neither does Ireland. But Scotland is kind of sticking up towards the Arctic Circle, and the farther you go north into Scotland, the rockier, colder, and less forested, the harder the life becomes. So traditionally, Scottish people, they're hunters and gatherers originally, just like everybody else. But the agricultural revolution didn't really work in Scotland as well as it would in Egypt, where the Nile Valley is just like the most fertile place on the planet. It's kind of the opposite. Living in Scotland would have been more like living in Sweden or Denmark or Norway. And that's probably why, those places, not just how close they are, but the type of land that it is, lend itself to Viking invasion and maybe a Viking lifestyle. One of the places in Scotland that I really want to go to is Orkney. And Orkney is just right off the tip. There's this island group at the top. The first one is Orkney, and then even farther north into the North Sea, getting towards the Arctic, is a place called the Shetlands. And I want to go there for two reasons. Highland Park is my favorite whiskey, and there's three. I forgot one. There's a Paleolithic, Neolithic site there called Skara Brae, and it's on one of the pages in my book. Where's my book? I'll bring your attention to it later, but in my book there's a screenshot of Skara Brae, which is a really old site. We kind of skipped over that because I didn't do my first lecture on video because of time constraints. So in the introduction there was this site called Skara Brae. So third thing is there's a Viking festival called the Fire Festival every year, where somebody dresses up with huge horns and they set a Viking ship on fire and push it into the water, and it looks really interesting. So, and it's, we ties into the stuff that we did earlier in this course. So I think it's a good idea for me to go there and see it firsthand, not just dream about it. So this is what Scotland is like. There's sheep and goats and herdsmen because the animals can live in the rugged terrain better. There's kind of two parts of Scotland as well, the Highlands and the Lowlands. And the Lowlands are the part that's south, closer to England, that has a little bit milder climate and is better for agriculture. And the Highlands is the really rocky, remote place where the people are extremely tough and they work really hard, and the population is less dense. Glasgow and Edinburgh are in the Lowlands, and the Highlands are the places where traditionally the clans, I'm going to generalize, but they generally were amazing fighters, individually anyway. They were very tough, very strong, very dangerous, and willing to fight. Maybe it was because of their tough upbringing, but the Highlanders units in the British Army, and when they fought for themselves, when they fought for Scotland in their history, nobody was conquering those guys because you didn't want to take an army into the rocky areas of Scotland. They would ambush you and attack you every which way until you went home. The Romans learned that the hard way. The English learned it the hard way many times. Scotland's not a place you want to invade. North Korea is also similar in its history. A lot of foreign countries have attacked, including Japan, and really only in the 20th century were they able to take over North Korea. North Korea and Korea in general resisted all kinds of countries' invasions. So Scotland's like that. In every other sense, they're nothing like North Korea, though. I'm not trying to say they're similar politically or culturally or historically, just sort of geopolitically or geographically. So that's the country that's to the north. The problem that the English have with them is that the Scottish are likely to raid. And that's, again, same thing with the Koreans. The Mongols and the Manchurians and the Chinese, there are various groups of people that were quite good fighters, hunters and nomads, and they would constantly invade. So what do you do about this? Well, Edward, King Edward, he decided he would do something about it. So first he went over to Wales and he conquered Wales, and that's when Wales was absorbed into the English kingdom. And we'll talk about Wales at some point too. I mentioned it because that's where the strongest presence of British culture that descends from Celtic culture is in Wales. It would help if you looked at the website and looked at the maps as you're listening to me. If you're watching on, I don't know, watching on your phone and you got your computer near you, or you're watching on your laptop and you got your phone, you can look at these maps. So when I say Wales, you can see it's in the west, and Scotland's in the north, and England's here, and London's here. So look at where these things are, because it will help you understand what I'm saying. Edward, who's called the Hammer of Scots, he takes over Wales first, absorbs them into his kingdom, and he names, after they take over Wales, the prince who will become the king next is called the Prince of Wales. From then on, it becomes an honorary title. That's why King Charles, sorry, he's not king, Prince Charles. Queen Elizabeth is the queen right now, and her son, the next person to become the monarch in England, is still called the Prince of Wales. So it's Charles, Prince of Wales. So he goes up to Scotland, and his object is to subdue the Scots and basically absorb the Scottish kingdom into the English. And he wins, and he defeats the Scots. They lose. A certain hero named William Wallace arises and leads the Scots. You might say he's the Scottish Issun Shin. He did not have anything to do with boats, but he was a national hero. He was the person who sacrificed himself. He was a very charismatic and powerful warrior personally, and he had great leadership skill. And he did, he battled hard against the English, and they did lose, but they continued to fight anyway. They lost many of the battles, but they continued to resist anyway. Issun Shin won all his battles, but in general, Korea was losing battles but continuing to fight, and eventually Korea won the Imjin War. So the same kind of thing happened. William Wallace was captured and killed. In a very horrible way. And Edward died, which was good for the Scots because he was the real problem. Edward was a really strong king and a very skilled administrator and very respected and talented. His son was not at all. Edward II had all kinds of problems. I can't talk about him in detail, but if you watch if you watch Braveheart, you'll see what I mean. Braveheart is not really historically accurate, but they do kind of a good job of portraying how Edward II is really unattractive to everyone, no matter what the real details are. He was not a popular king, and he wasn't a good military leader, so he tried to keep going with what his father did, but he failed. So after William Wallace, a person named Robert the Bruce became the King of Scotland, and there's basically two wars. The first one, the Scots lose, basically, to Edward, but then Edward dies, and there's a period of sort of ceasefire, and then no fighting. And then it starts up again, and Robert the Bruce and the rest of the Scots carry on the fight until they manage to repel the English and wear them down, so they realize that this is never going to work, and they go back to England and give up. and those are called the Scottish Wars of Independence. So if you remember anything about the Scots, remember rugged terrain, they're tough, they have a lot of herds, they have a lower population than England, but they're very tough and tenacious, and they're very proud of their own culture. Their culture is also connected to the Celtic culture, so they don't want to be like the English. They have kilts, they have man dresses, and they have their own way organization. They have clans of people. We'll come back to Scotland later, especially in the Reformation, because Scotland sort of carves its own path in terms of its religion as well. But remember William Wallace, he's the hero. I'll probably put a clip of Braveheart up on the website for you, because normally I show it in class, but I can't show it to you. So I'll put a link just to one of the battle scenes. So just remember, I usually warn my students, like, if you don't like violent stuff, and you know, like swords and pointy things sticking into people and horses, just watch it until you can't watch it and turn it off, or close your eyes to that part, whatever. I'm giving you the warning right now, okay? Anyway, it's supposed to be portraying how things went when the English tried to take away the sovereignty of the Scots and failed. So that happens, you know, around 1300, and it takes 400 years for the English to convince the Scots to join them and become Great Britain. But they do eventually do that, and that's another evolution that we have to talk about. The evolution of Scotland and England towards each other. At this point, they try to combine the kingdoms. They have wars over it, and they break apart, and their branches go in different directions. But you'll see later in this course that what really creates British culture is this what am I trying to say? This convergence of Scottish and English culture. I end up talking about England more than I probably should, but mostly that's because London is the center of England and the most important influence on English culture, and England is the larger part, the senior partner of the relationship, so it has a larger effect on British culture. But we're not ignoring the Scottish contribution at all, because there are huge ways that Scotland influences England, and England will never be the same once they start having this close relationship. So next, you don't have to worry about 1296. That's when the Scottish Wars break out. We'll keep going. Briefly, 1315, exactly 100 years after Magna Carta, there's famine throughout Europe. They have really bad weather, which causes, actually there's, for about 200 years, there was really warm, good weather, and the farmers were able to produce more food than they had in the past. So from about 1000, from the time that William the Conqueror takes over in the middle of the 11th century, for about 200 years, they get this really good weather and warmer than normal weather that allows, especially in England or Northern Europe where it's normally colder, it allows them to produce more food, and the population gets larger and larger. And this is when Occam's razor comes in and decides that it's going to reduce the supply of food suddenly, and then people starve. So who knows how many people died, but thousands of people died. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people died all over Europe because it suddenly got colder, and they had something called the Little Ice Age, which the temperature dropped suddenly. You know, I shouldn't say suddenly, but over a few decades, the temperature dropped quickly, almost like a climate change situation like we've been experiencing recently. You know, like the temperature drops several degrees over 50 years. And this makes a big difference. This is one of the reasons we know that it's dangerous for us to increase the temperature 2 or 3 degrees, because how much of an effect a few degrees has. So this climate change event, which may have been the the cause of it may have been a gigantic volcano exploding in Indonesia, one of the biggest volcanoes in the last, few thousand years, exploded in Indonesia, and it was such a big explosion. It was like 100 atomic bombs going off, and it threw dust in the air. That's one of the theories about why the temperature dropped, is that there was so much dust in the air that the sunlight couldn't penetrate as well. So this cooled. I don't know about those theories. That's not my area of expertise, but this is all the stuff that people propose could have been the reason. Whatever the reason is, food supply was low, population was high, many people died, and the people that survived were not healthy. If you grow up and you're starving and you don't get enough food while you're growing up, you're shorter, and your muscles are less developed, and your brain is less developed, and everything. So there's a lot of people who their immune systems are compromised, so their bodies are really weak. So this whole generation grows up, and they're not as healthy as their grandparents or great-grandparents were. They're much weaker because of the food shortages. So even when the food supply and the climate starts to sort of and the number of people and the food starts to balance out, you still have all these people that get sick easily. Okay? So this sets up the worst disaster in European history that we know of anyway. But in the period I'm talking about, it's the worst. World War II is comparable in some ways, but as a proportion of the population being affected, there's no comparison. What happens is something called the Black Death. I normally don't have much to compare this to, but with the coronavirus spreading around the world and the director, anyway, his name's Dr. Fauci. What is he the director of? He's the director of a government department. I can't remember exactly his title, but he's the one doing the press conferences in the United States right now. He's the one in charge, even though Donald Trump delegated Mike Pence. He's the expert who's really in charge, essentially. He did a press conference the other day, and he said some really scary things, like 100,000 people dying or more in the United States. That's a number that you don't see anywhere else in United States history except for wars, and not small wars, like big wars like World War I, World War II, the American Civil War. You see numbers like that. So this could be, I hate to compare it like this, but this drives the point home about both how terrible. If you think the coronavirus is terrible, the Black Death is worse. And if you think the coronavirus is not a big deal, think again, because it's like the Black Death, just not as, we're more prepared and we have medicine. But imagine we didn't. If we had the coronavirus and it was the Middle Ages and you just had a bunch of people who had beliefs about how they should treat things, and the only people available were not scientists. They were maybe, your nanny, a servant, a priest, a minister, a nun. These are the people that normally take care of you when you're sick, but they're not surgeons. They don't have clean equipment or anything. People don't have toilets. They're just throwing garbage and their human waste out the window. You walk in it every day. Imagine we had coronavirus in that environment. The death rates would be unbelievable. Okay? So if you take the Black Death and you put it into a modern society, you're not going to get anything like you would in the medieval times. But you just got to remember, people are, first of all, I just said, people are weaker than usual because of the famine. People's bodies are weak. So when they get infected, they die easier anyway. But they're also surrounded by garbage and disease all the time. They get sick all the time. I guess their immune systems could be stronger from fighting diseases all the time. But when a new disease comes that they have no protection to, it just wipes out everybody. The estimations are all over the place, but the most common number you hear is something like 1 in 3 people, 30%. In some places it's much worse. Some cities in Italy and some cities in Northern Europe, including England, it's 50%. Like 1 in every If 50% of Daejeon died, we have about 1.5 million people. If 50% of us died, that would be 750,000 people in one city. If half of New York died, you're talking like New York's over 10 million people, easy. You're talking about 5 million people dying in one city. It's crazy. So even though we have the coronavirus, it's still, the Black Death is hard to get your head around. It was an incredibly traumatizing event. There's a write-up on the Black Death on the website, so I'm not going to talk about it in too much detail, except that go in the textbook and read about the Black Death and see the things that I talk about, because this is the kind of thing that's going to be on the test, right? What was the effect of the Black Death? 1 in 3 people died. So what was the result? Economic disaster. People couldn't travel anywhere. People died all over the place. So people, certain jobs, you know, if you had one blacksmith in your village and he died, and who's going to make things out of metal? Nobody. Nobody's been trained. Nobody knows how to do it. So you end up, maybe you end up doing it yourself, or somebody knows a little bit, but the quality of that, you know, profession is just going to disappear, right? If you have an expert and then you go to somebody who hasn't spent years and years training from a master, you're going to end up with, you know, horses that have their shoes, you know, stuck on sideways and stuff like that. So it happens in every profession. But one of the biggest, the one that I want to talk about the most, is one of the biggest effects was on the church, because, you know, most people couldn't read, and the language of the church is done in Latin. So this is a huge effect on the future of English society, is that they depended on this very educated group of people who knew about the Bible, and they were experts in reading and writing, and they were the highly educated people that provided information and funeral rites and counseling and poor relief and everything else to the communities. All of these, you know, these priests, all of the clergy, they start dying just like everybody else, and some of them just keep working, just like our doctors and health workers and nurses and everybody else who's exposing themselves and working hard, even though they know they're in a hospital where people are sick. Lots of people are doing it, and we should be very thankful to those people. But some people are refusing to do it. I have a friend, I just talked to her yesterday. She's in Canada, and she works at a nursing home, what Koreans call Silver Town. It's old people. She works in Hamilton, Ontario. They had their first case of coronavirus at an old folks' home. And she works there, and she said half of the people that work in her nursing home, the place to care for old people, half of them refuse to come to work because they're afraid of catching it from, because one of the people that lived in the retirement home has the virus. And so half of them wouldn't go. They just stayed home and they won't come to work. So she's there, and she's at more risk. She has to take care of twice as many people as she normally would. So I don't want to judge people, but she's pretty upset because she's working harder to make up for the people that are protecting themselves. It's a tough thing to do, to decide whether who's right and who's wrong. And, you know, the temptation to just stay away from everybody is there. But all of my friends who are nurses or doctors or anything else, they're working harder than usual. And you should be very thankful for all those people who do that, because without them, we would all be getting sick and we would all be dying. That's what happened in the Black Death. Priests and people who are supposed to do things stopped helping victims. They stopped burying people, for one thing. They stopped doing funerals. They stopped doing prayers. And the ones that did often got sick and died. And the ones that didn't, you know, they had to, you know, get away and isolate themselves, essentially, right? So you end up having a lower quality, and when all of these professionals and middle-aged people die who have expertise, they all get wiped out at the same time. And so it dilutes the quality of the people in these areas. And you end up with, of course, priests that are younger and not as committed to their work, and don't have the expertise, don't have the knowledge. So the quality of what the service, spiritually, religiously, socially, financially, everything gets degraded. And so obviously a lot of people who were, everybody's super religious, but they start to be less supportive of the institution of the Catholic Church. And you'll see this is an evolution as well. And it's not like people stop going to church, because people are still super religious. But they have all kinds of certain beliefs. They don't know where it comes from. Actually, it's a bacterium that gets carried on fleas, on on rats, on boats, and then it makes its way through, you know, ports, boats, and by caravans, and by trading, and by traveling. So trading and traveling, you know, stops, just like it has been happening now, and they're unable to do anything until the plague just goes through everybody and essentially just burns itself out, and then there's nobody left. And then a few years later it comes back and it burns through the population and it does it again. And they just think it's never going to go away, and that God is basically saying, human beings are sinful and you're bad people, and this is what you get, where I'm going to just wipe the earth of human beings with this Black Death punishment. So people are still intensely religious, but their confidence in the Catholic Church is shaken, and it never really, I would say, fully recovers. And eventually the church will break away from the Catholic Church for various reasons, but we'll talk about that. This is definitely something that has an effect. The reason we know it has an effect is because there's a guy in the next generation who's born during the Black Death, basically. His name's John Wycliffe, and this is in the textbook too. And John Wycliffe has a different philosophy about religion. It's very almost democratic, where he thinks individuals should be able to read the Bibles themselves, and they don't need priests to tell them how to read it, and that the Bible should be translated into English. It shouldn't be stuck in a language that's, you know, a Roman language from 1,000 years ago that only priests can read. He thinks the Bible should be accessible, and we should be focused on the Word, not the institution. Okay, and these ideas, probably, you might, if you know anything about the Reformation and Martin Luther, you'd be like, wow, that sounds like Luther. Yeah, it does. Except it was a full 150 years earlier, and it's not a revolution because it doesn't catch on, and the government suppresses it, and the Catholic Church suppresses it, and it kind of goes underground, like a counterculture or a subculture. So the dominant culture remains, and John Wycliffe's ideas get suppressed, and then they make a comeback after Luther ignites the religious revolution that we call the Reformation in Germany, and then it makes its way back to England. And these are the Bible translation that he does is suppressed, like I said, and there's no printing press to distribute it, so it doesn't. There's not as many copies. Martin Luther just, you know, uses Gutenberg's technology just to print things faster than the Catholics can burn them. But yeah, Wycliffe couldn't do that. So everything has to be written by hand still. Chaucer is the other guy that I mentioned, who was also born during the Black Death. He writes a really, it's one of my favorite pieces of writing of all time. He writes something called the Canterbury Tales. It's about a group of people going on a pilgrimage. Like, this is Samuel Beckett, right? They're going to Samuel Beckett's shrine in Canterbury, and they're traveling. They're all traveling there, and they meet at a hotel, and it's called an inn. And they before they set off, they start swapping stories. I think it's been a while, but I should reread it. The innkeeper offers them a free meal and free board. Like, you can stay at the hotel for free and eat for free if you tell the best story. And so each person, one by one, tells their story, and the innkeeper is going to choose the best story. So you get, a knight and a divorced wife and a person who works for the church. You get a cross-section of medieval society, all the different types we've been talking about. He, one by one, tells these stories, and he does it in such a way that you almost get a sampling of different types of people. And he's very critical, especially of the the parson, the priest, the parson, and the religious, the pardoner. These religious figures, he's very, very critical of them. And you can tell that he's just sort of disgusted with their behavior, and like everybody is judging them. Like they care, they're superficial people. They care about their education, their station, their power, their clothing. They're not the type of person that is modeled after Jesus in the Bible. It's sort of modeled after a privileged, wealthy person who has a more comfortable life because they're part of the Catholic Church. And that's very early, you know, way before, you know, England decides not to be Catholic anymore. So this, I think it's true that the Black Death triggered this sentiment of sort of at least more criticism and more skepticism of what the Catholic Church is doing all the time, and how much money that they're using for their own purposes rather than helping the people. Okay, so please read the textbook to get more detail, because I'm trying to keep these lectures around an hour long, and if I explain any more speaking to you, you're going to be watching these videos forever. So you need to read the stuff on the cyber lecture. I mentioned before, we have this video lecture on YouTube, and you can subscribe to this channel because we're going to try and do the live thing. Please subscribe and identify yourself, though, if you want me to understand who you are. If you just want to connect and have your own ID, but if you want me to understand who you are, you need to at least email me and say, well, this is my username and this is my student number, or something like that, okay? So you can subscribe to the YouTube channel and you can watch that all the time. The second most important thing is the textbook. Video lecture is the most important thing. Textbook is the second most important thing. The website is number 3, and then there's slides. Those slides would normally be sort of in the background while I was speaking. I'm not sure if I can somehow do the slides with my lectures, but I don't think I need to, because you can just look at them. Just remember, when you look at the slides, only the slides that are related to what I say, that reinforce what I'm saying in my video lecture, would count. So if you go and you learn something completely new that's not related to the textbook, because those slides are older and include some things that I normally don't test, just be aware that the video lecture and the textbook are really, this is the holy grail of the class. So if it's not in the textbook, it's not on the test. Okay? And the things that I emphasize in the video lecture are the most important things, always. Okay, so Chaucer, Wycliffe, read about them. One more thing to talk about before I close the lecture for today. The Peasant Revolt of 1381 is another moment where the clash between, you know, the people, what the people want, and what the government and the chain of being dictates people should do. So one of the things that you might say is a side effect of the Black Death, or a main effect, but it has a benefit to it, is that the population, it was sort of, England was overpopulated, and when you have too many people and not enough work, you know, that means you get paid less for your work. So when the plague goes through and wipes out a generation of people, the next generation that grows up, that generation and the next generation that grows up are much smaller than the previous generations, and there's a lot of work to do and less people to do it. So this drives the price up, not the price, the wages. It drives the wages up. So people started to get used to, after the Black Death, that generation got used to being paid. I've seen different figures of it. I think the Economist that I read said something like 70% increase in wages over that period. So they're making not quite double what their parents made, and they get used to this. Then obviously the rich people, the barons that we talked about in the Magna Carta, they want their rights protected, but they don't want peasants to have too many rights. So they don't want the peasants to be able to work for anybody else. They don't want competition, because that drives wages up. So for example, if I'm working for this baron here, and Baron, we'll just call him Baron James, I don't know, Baron James isn't paying me what I think I should be paid, but over there, there's another baron, or baroness, we'll say it's a woman, a baroness. She, we'll call her Jennifer, Baroness Jennifer, she's paying 50% more. I'm just going to pick up all my stuff, move to that town, and do my farming on her land. Or, you know, leather working, or metalwork, or pottery, or whatever it is that I do. I'm going to do it in the place that pays me more money. And the mobility is something that was attractive to the people too. So leading up to the revolt, the Peasant Revolt, what the king and the rich people were trying to do was make laws to prevent people being able to do something that the social situation, the demographic situation had allowed them to do. So because there was less people, they could get paid more, and they were more valuable, and they could move around. And this upset the whole balance of, you know, less rich people died, but rich people still died. So there's empty castles around. There's parts of England that just get abandoned. So, you know, over the next 100 years, there's nobody to grow any food or to cut down the trees or anything. So the forest just takes over and just takes back the land. And some of that land still isn't used for farming since the Black Death. So these people get used to these improvements, I guess, in their social situation, their financial situation, in their freedom. And then the king, young King Richard, he's a boy king, actually, he decides to take him away. So when the king and his administration, his administrators do this, basically the people freak out. They get together with a lot of weapons. They're really angry. They find this guy named Wat Tyler, who's a good leader and has experience fighting, apparently. People don't know very much about him. Wat Tyler leads this group of thousands of peasants around the countryside towards London, and on the way, they kill people, they capture people, they burn things down, and they destroy documents that about, you know, slavery or property rights or records of people's taxes and stuff, because of course it's all about taxes again. The king is trying to fight wars in France and, you know, support his military by raising taxes on the peasants, and the peasants hate that, in addition to the other grievances like I'm not allowed to get paid, I'm not allowed to move and work somewhere else, and now you're asking me to pay more taxes too. I might explode also. So all these people go marching around, destroying stuff. They go to London to force the king to give them what they want. When they're there, the king bravely meets them and tries to negotiate with them. But in the encounter, the mayor of London gets angry about something, or just decides he's going to get rid of this problem. And he stabs Wat Tyler right in front of the king. Probably for being disrespectful, but we don't really know, I think. And he kills Wat Tyler right there. And then as soon as their leader gets killed, the peasants are disorganized, and they start to, they sort of miss their chance to really force the king to do anything. So they start to become disorganized, and some groups separate and start going home. And then the king sends out his men and just, you know, run the horses and men with soldiers, run through them all and disperse them, and they all run away. And there's a really famous quote that Richard says, "Peasants you are, and peasants you will be, except now even more so." Peasants you are, and peasants you will be, he says, after he has stomped on their attempt to change the rules. So that was almost a revolution, but not. So that's what we call a revolt. It was an attempt at a revolution, but the king shut that down. So all of these things, you can see how they're sort of related to each other, and they continue this process of the struggle between citizens, people, and the government and the king. So that's the point where we're going to stop today, except to mention that in 1453, which is a good point to just draw a line. I know it's not really a line, but sometimes this is very helpful. We've been going from 1066. I'm going to say the Middle Ages for England sort of spans the Norman Conquest from 1066 to 1453. In 1453 is when the English lose the 100 Years' War, and France, including Joan of Arc, in the early stages, defeat England and push them out of France for good. And they never recover. They retain the small area in northern France called Calais, which is a very famous place, but it's very small. It's just a English port surrounded by French territory. So all they have left is just a small corner called Calais. And after they lose the 100 Years' War, of course, a king would, a very poor king would be the ruler of England, Henry VI, a weak king. So there's a power struggle that goes on called the War of the Roses, which was named the War of the Roses later. But for the next 3 decades, England will fight with itself in a civil war between different groups of people that claim the right to be the king. So that War of the Roses is actually the inspiration for Game of Thrones, if any of you have seen that series. If you haven't, you should, because it's amazing. Mostly because it seems very realistic. Even though there's dragons in there and stuff, a lot of the political stuff and the personal stuff that goes on and the violence of the period kind of shows you what medieval life was like. So right then, at 1453, the English lose the 100 Years' War, retreat from France, give up. And in the east, the Turkish army takes over Constantinople, and that's really a difference, a good point to say, okay, the Middle Ages are over, now we're moving into the early modern period. The Ottoman Empire is going to expand, and always in the east there's going to be this Turkish presence, and from now on, soon there's going to be the Spanish in the west in Europe, and the Turkish in the east, and the northern powers of France and Germany and England are going to start, and which will become the British, is going to start to grow. But right now, England at 1453 is pretty much back to its little corner of the world, a not important corner of the European continent, off on its own 20 kilometers from France, and it's not a world power at all. It's really not influential. So it compared to the point where half of France was part of England, England has shrunk back into its original territory, you might say. But from this point on, it's going to change again, and the English and then the British are going to gain momentum steadily. So we will talk about Henry VII and his infamous son Henry VIII next lecture. That's what we'll be getting into. So please, like I said, I'm trying to do my best to summarize all the material in 1 hour, but I would like you to read this chapter carefully and go to the resources on the website as well, so that you can back up what I'm saying with some more detail. Okay, so that's it. It's over. It's time for breakfast. Have a good day, and I will talk to you soon. Please follow the email formatting. I'm going to upload a file, a PDF file with specific instructions, because I'm getting so many emails. You have to follow the instructions. And I'll mention some other things in general as well for you to look over. So that file will be up later today, so that you can check and make sure you're doing everything right when you contact me. Okay? Thank you very much.